Okay, just a few more sentences and we'll get through these ones very quickly. Let's just remember that we're dealing only with these first two questions. Is there a verb and is there a subject? So how about this next sentence? Stacy late for school. Do we have a verb? Let's go with no. We don't have a verb in here. We have late, it's describing Stacy, but we don't have a verb. So let's say that this is a fragment. We need something like Stacy is late for school, Stacy was late for school, Stacy is going to be late for school. So in this case, we have no verb. That definitely makes it a fragment. What about this next example? Went to the store with Alex. Do we have a verb? Let's go with went. We have went as our verb. And now we have to ask, do we have a subject? I'm going to say no. We do have nouns in this sentence. We have store and Alex, but we don't have anybody that's performing this verb went. This could be I went to the store, he went to the store, she went to the store, they went to the store, we went to the store. It could really be anybody. So this statement is fragment because we don't have a subject. Now, in some languages, verbs are conjugated so specifically that they can occasionally leave out the subject, but in English, we can only do that in commands. What about this next statement? We just have stop. So, do we have a verb? I'm going to say that we do have a verb. Our verb is stop. So, it might not seem like a verb. It's not as obvious as an action as something like run, jump, hop, skip, but it is still a verb. Even if it means that you're ceasing an activity, that you're no longer doing it, it still functions as an action. You're stopping something. Let's go with stop as our verb. So, we do have a verb. What about our next question? Do we have a subject? So, do we have anybody performing this verb? We do have a subject. So, this is a command. This is an example of a command. And in commands, we omit the subject. That's the only time in the English language where you are supposed to omit the subject. So, it would be unnatural to say something like you stop, you go. But in a command, our subject, it's always an implied you. So, in real life, if you ask somebody to stop, if you look at somebody and say stop, then that person is the subject for your sentence. So I'm going to say this is a complete sentence. We have a verb, stop. Our subject is an implied you. How about imagine a dog on the side of the road? Our first question again is, do we have a verb? Let's say yes, we have the verb imagine. And now, do we have a subject? Now, the subject always performs the verb. So, it can't be the dog, it can't be the road. They're not imagining anything. So, you want to ask who or what is imagining or should imagine. Let's go with an implied you again. Here we have another command. It's not as obvious as commands like stop, jump, run, skip, but you're basically asking the reader to imagine something. And actually, I get a lot of errors in student writing with commands like these. When they ask the reader to imagine something or to consider something, they treat it as just a phrase. And you want to remember that's a complete sentence on its own. So imagine a dog on the side of the road. Imagine is our verb and an implied you is our subject. Our last statement reads skipping through the meadow. So again, we want to ask ourselves, do we have a verb? If you want to say that skipping is the verb, I can understand that. I'll argue against it in just a little bit, but for now, yeah, let's go with skipping as our verb. And then our next question is, do we have a subject? So is anybody performing this verb? Let's say no. So we did just finish talking about how in commands we omit the subject, we leave out the subject when we have a command, but skipping through the meadow cannot work as a command. When we use commands, we use the root form of the verb. So notice that we didn't say stopping or imagining. We said stop, imagine. In commands, we use the root form of the verb. If we wanted it to be a command, we'd have to change it to skip through the meadow. It'd be kind of an absurd command, but that would be complete. But skipping through the meadow, by itself, it's just a fragment. We don't know who was skipping through the meadow. So to correct it, we can correct it in a few different ways. We could write something like, he was skipping through the meadow. And then in this case, was skipping would be our verb phrase because was and skipping are working together. And then he would be our subject. So we could say, he was skipping through the meadow. We could also take this opening phrase and say something like, skipping through the meadow is dangerous. And in this case, skipping through the meadow would be our subject. Just like in that previous example when we said playing basketball is fun, we were talking about the act of playing basketball. In this case, we have is as our verb and then skipping through the meadow as our subject. We're telling somebody that the act of skipping through the meadow is dangerous. We could also take the statement and use it as an opening phrase and say something like, skipping through the meadow, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. And in this case, skipping through the meadow would work as an opening participle phrase describing what Frank was doing while he was stung by a swarm of bees. This example actually demonstrates the most common cause for fragments in student writing. Most of the time when students have fragments in their writing, it's just a matter of fixing their punctuation. If they read their writing out loud, it sounds fine. It flows smoothly. Nobody would notice any grammatical errors. But they end up with fragments because they're basically just putting periods where they don't need them. And typically they do that when they have a dependent clause and they just leave a dependent clause or dependent phrase by itself, like in this example. So they might write something like, skipping through the meadow, period, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. And then I find it very frustrating if I point it out to them. A lot of times the writers will simplify their writing and change it to something like, Frank was skipping through the meadow, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. Now, if we compare these two examples, I still strongly prefer skipping through the meadow, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. The other version is grammatically correct, but it's very, very choppy, it's very simplistic. The first version flows more smoothly, there's a closer relationship between the ideas, but they just have a period where they don't need one. So you want to avoid those grammatical errors, but you want to also remember that most of the time it's just a matter of changing your punctuation. Sometimes students are just writing too fast and leaving out words and they'll end up with fragments, but most of the time they're just leaving a dependent clause by itself like this. So remember, you don't want skipping through the meadow, period. You just change that to a comma, join it to the next clause. Skipping through the meadow, comma, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. Or what if you want to add while, you could say, while skipping through the meadow, Frank was stung by a swarm of bees. But just don't have dependent clauses like this by themselves. I actually get the most fragments from students who are using more advanced sentence structures. So if you end up with a lot of fragments in your writing, if you need to work on your punctuation, don't get discouraged because it probably means that you're writing at a more advanced level. You just need to learn the punctuation. So we'll discuss this more in our next video when we get to this question about whether a statement can stand on its own. But I hope you always remember that if you ever spot fragments in your writing, just ask yourself first, can I just change the punctuation? Read what you have before that sentence, read what you have afterward, and ask yourself, can I just remove one of my periods? Because that's almost always the best solution for fragments that appear in student writing.